Hello everybody, welcome back to the Farming Simulator 25 tips and tricks video. Today we're going to take a look at part 2 of a 3-part graphics video series where we take a look at running Farm Sim on various types of hardware. In the first video I showed you my GPU settings for my main gaming rig, which is running a 4070 Ti Super at 1440p. In this video, well, we're dialing it back quite a fair bit. We're going to be running Farm Sim on a little mini all-in-one PC running a AMD 7840HS CPU and an AMD 780M integrated graphics. What this video is going to show you is that you can indeed run Farm Sim 25 on an integrated graphics system at 1080p at 60 frames per second. Now, there's a little caveat to this 60 frames per second because it's actually using FSR frame gen in order to get to 60 frames per second. But what you're going to see in this video is that we've got a very, very nice looking image, a very smooth image with respect to moving around, and, well, again, it's pulling about 50 to 60 watts from the wall. What we can see in the upper left is an overlay of the system's configuration. We see 60 FPS. We can see we're running an AMD 7840HS CPU once again, and that is an APU in the fact that it has a GPU and the CPU all on the same die. This particular CPU is 8-core, 16 threads, but it doesn't really matter because we're not using nearly all those cores or threads for Farm Sim. You can see we're running about 22% utilization on the CPU. With respect to our graphics, we're using the AMD 780M integrated graphics that comes on the 7840HS die. You see that is running about 75% and is pulling about 25 watts by itself. Meanwhile, the CPU itself is also pulling 25 watts. So right now, we're pulling a total of 50 watts from the wall, and we're playing Farm Sim solid 60 FPS, again at 1080p. Now, if you are struggling with running Farm Sim at a nice solid 60 FPS, and you're running anything that is basically a discrete GPU, then you should be able to run these settings or something higher in order to maintain a nice solid 60 FPS. If you've got an integrated system from, let's say, Intel, I really don't have much experience with Intel integrated graphics. I don't have any systems here at the house with Intel integrated graphics, so I really can't run Farm Sim on anything like that. But I will tell you that these AMD APUs have been fairly popular in recent years with respect to low-end cheap laptops or mini PCs. I think I picked up this particular PC for probably less than $500. And you may think to yourself, well, I can get a sub $500 gaming system with a discrete graphics. And yeah, you could. But can you hold that system in the palm of your hand? No. Can you pack it away in a book bag? No. Could you put it in a suitcase when you're traveling? No. But you can with this particular system. And it runs off a USB-C charger. So you just drop a USB-C charger in your bag, drop this little mini system in your bag. When you get to the hotel, plug it up with a wireless keyboard and mouse, plug it into HDMI into the hotel TV, and there you go. You're off to gaming on a mini PC. Now we're going to be talking about our settings here in a little bit. We are using frame gen, and you will see a little bit of visual artifacts here and there. We saw a little bit right there, some flashing on the road. We'll sometimes see some flashing in the sky, depending on how fast we're moving around. But overall, in order to get pretty close to 60 FPS on this little system, pulling less than 50 watts from the wall, that is pretty impressive if you ask me. Now, just like part 1, we're going to be doing the same loop. So now we're going to go over to town. We're going to stop over at Central Cafe. We're going to look at the various textures. We're then going to make our way to the ferry. We're going to go across the ferry, and we're going to loop back over to the main farm. In part 3, which is going to come out tomorrow if you're watching this video on the day of its release, we're going to do this same type of video, this same loop, using a Windows handheld gaming system. Now, it's using the 7840U APU from AMD, which means that it's 8-core, 16-thread, just like this one, except it has the U moniker on it, which means it's designed to run at a lower power rating. Here we can see the textures look nice and clear. We are running 1080p. I did upscale this a little bit in Adobe Premiere because we are recording this video, we are going to be releasing this video as a 4K edit. But I can tell you that overall everything looks very, very nice, very crisp at 1080p. And now let's go ahead and make our way down to the ferry. Now, one thing you may notice between this particular setup, as far as the graphic settings and the settings from my main gaming rig, is that the shadows are a little less smooth. So they're more crisp, not crisp. How should I say it? They're more jagged, right? They kind of look more like FS22 shadows, quite honestly, as opposed to the smoother shadows that we see with respect to FS25 on the main gaming system. Now, at any point in time, if you want to go ahead and jump to the graphics settings, I will have a timestamp to that down in the description. But I do want to go ahead and finish this approximate 12-minute loop in order to take us back to the main farm. Then we'll talk about our GPU settings. And I want to actually show you what GPU settings comes up when you load FarmSim on this type of hardware by default. And I tell you what, it looks absolutely atrocious. I recorded the same 12-minute clip with the default settings, and we're going to run that toward the end of the video if you just want to have a little bit of a look and see how different that setup compares to this setup. And I will say that this setup looks far, far better. There you can see the shadows, kind of how they are moving jagged. They were moving a lot smoother in the main gaming video. That's because, of course, we've had to make a few sacrifices with respect to settings in order to be able to make a nice, solid 60 FPS. Our GPU load is hovering right there around 70-75% the whole time. So we do have a little bit of headroom, and we're going to be using this exact setup going forward to compare maps as they release, and I'll be able to comment on how well a map played on a lower end system. This is the very system that I'll be using for that particular comparison, and I'll be able to say, yeah, I was able to get a nice solid 60 FPS when looking or moving around a mod map. And that's going to give you a little bit of a idea if maybe you're running a weaker system as to possibly how a map might perform on your particular system. Here we're going to scroll out and we're going to get a nice distance view. And then we can kind of do a little pan around. You see our rendering circle isn't all that bad. Foliages on the trees looks pretty good. Distance trees aren't popping in, so we can see the trees at a pretty good distance here as well. Now, just to talk a little bit more about this overlay, you can see the RAM usage of 11.4 gigabytes of 23.8 gigabytes. You may say to yourself, 23.8, that's kind of an odd number. Well, since this is an APU, the 7840M has reserved some of the RAM for its own graphics memory. So that's why we have 23.8 gigs of system memory. The system has 32 gigs of total memory in it. I was actually having a little fun with this AI car. You know, it passed me there and then it had to stop for the pedestrian. And now I've passed it. It's going to come along and pass me here again. And then it's going to come up and stop at the intersection. And then I'm going to get ahead of it again. So it's a nice little kind of give and take. But overall, even when we get into these denser areas where you have more textures, more buildings and other things to render, we're fairly close to our target 60 FPS. It's fairly smooth, not a whole lot of stuttering or jitter. Also is showing up here. And now that we've made our way back to the farm, let's go ahead and pull up our GPU settings, and we'll talk about the settings that we have on our mini PC here, where we're getting our, air quote, 60 FPS, because again, we are using frame gen in order to achieve that. So we're running a medium custom setup at 1080p. I do have VSync turned on, and again, our frame limit is set to 60 FPS. In this case, we are running full screen mode, 100% resolution scaling, 1.0 on the brightness, and again, I like to drop the HUD scale down a little bit, so we're running 70% on the in-game HUD scale. Now, with respect to our advanced graphics settings, we have 150% on our object draw distance for most of these settings. So 150% on object draw distance, foliage draw distance, LOD distance, and terrain LOD distance. And then foliage LOD distance, we actually have it set at 100%. Resolution scaling is set to 100%. Shader quality is set to medium. Shading rate is set to medium. Screen space shading rate is set to off. Screen space reflections is also set to off. Screen space shadows is set to off. And SSAO quality is set to high. Scrolling down, atmosphere quality is set to medium. Volumetric fog quality is set to medium. Cloud shadows is turned off. Terrain quality, high. Texture resolution, low. And texture filtering is trilinear. Light quality, we have it set to high. Lens flare quality is turned off. Shadow quality, medium, as well as shadow distance quality. Soft shadows are turned off, and shadow map filtering is set to low. Foliage shadows are set to off, as is realistic beacon lights. Field of view is set to 70%. Player first person field of view is 60. Player third person field of view is 40. Max shadow lights is set to 1. Max mirrors is set to 3. Max tire tracks is set to 100. And mesh texturization volume is set to 150. As far as post-processing, I have that set to off. Multi-sample anti-aliasing is also set to off. Sharpening is set to 1. And scaling mode, well, that is where we are going to see the magic sauce, with respect to being able to have a nice solid 60 FPS. So we're using FSR 3's upscaling. DRS quality, or dynamic resolution scaling quality, is set to off. That means the target FPS value is not really bothered with, so you can just leave it at 60. The upscaling quality is set to quality, and Fidelity FX Super Resolution 3 Frame Gen is set to on. And that's why we saw a 30 FPS in the upper right frame counter, then we had a bar, and then we had 60 FPS. The game was really rendering at 30, but with Frame Gen, it was adding an extra frame in between each of the rendered frames, so we were seeing 60 FPS, and that's what was giving us a nice, smooth gameplay. Now, let's take a look and see what the default Giants graphics settings were for this particular system. Now, if you've not changed your graphics settings and you have a lower end system, you may have something that looks pretty bad, and these are the settings that are to blame. We have low hardware profile. We have 1280 by 720p video resolution. VSync is turned on, 60 FPS frame limit. We have full screen as far as our windowed mode. Resolution scaling is 100%. Brightness it was 1.0. And then I adjusted, again, the in-game HUD down to 70%, simply because at 100% and 720p, it's like the HUD is like 80% of your screen. Taking a look at the advanced settings, object draw distance is defaulted to 75%, foliage draw distance 100%, LOD distance 75, train LOD distance 75, and foliage LOD distance 80%. Resolution scaling is 100%. Shader quality, shading rate, they're both set to low. Screen space shading rate is off. Screen space reflections is set to off. Screen space shadows is set to off. And SSAO quality is set to medium. Scrolling down the list, atmosphere quality is set to low. Volumetric fog, low. Cloud shadows is set to off. Terrain quality, medium. Texture resolution, low. And texture filtering, bilinear. Light quality, we've got actually a high setting here. Lens flare, off. Shadow quality, off. Shadow distance quality, low. Soft shadows, off. And shadow map filtering, low. As far as foliage shadows, that is also set to off. Realistic beacons is set to off. Field of view 70. First person field of view 60. Third person field of view is 40. Max shadows 1. Max mirrors 3. Max tire tracks 50%. Mesh texturization 100%. Post-processing anti-aliasing TAA. And of course, in my settings, I could have probably set TAA and it wouldn't have too much effect with respect to our overall frame rate. Multi-sampling anti-aliasing is set to off. Sharpness is set to 1. And upscaling, well, it's all set to off. So all of the other settings are locked below that. So you ready to see what these default graphics settings look like? Well, here you go. So we're going to run our same loop that we ran with our optimal settings, if you will, using our default Giants graphics settings on the same hardware. You're seeing that we're not really able to maintain a solid 60 FPS like we had with our better settings, and everything just looks like absolute trash. You're going to see there's zero shadows. No shadows whatsoever. And while the shadows in the first segment were kind of jagged, at least they were there. Here, it's eternal, I guess, over cloud. There's nothing. There's no shadows anywhere. You're going to see when we get up here to this plowed field, it just looks, again, like absolute garbage because those view distances are so low. As we get close, we can actually see the textures rendering in. We can see the low textures not too far off in the distance. So our rendering circle is going to be pretty small with respect to these settings. And again, these are not the settings I would recommend. These were the default settings out of the box for this particular hardware. I'm going to go ahead and let this run all the way through. Again, this 12-minute loop. If you want to watch it, that's fine. You can compare it to the first part of this video. You can then compare it to parts 1, which is already out, which is the one that is using my main gaming rig, which again is a 4070 Ti Super for the GPU. Or you could also then compare this with the next video that's about to come out, which is going to cover Windows handheld gaming and farming simulator. And we've got very similar settings being suggested with respect to the Giants configuration. And then I've gone in and adjusted these settings a little bit in order to dial back that power requirement, because here we're still using 40 watts, 20 watts between the CPU, 20 watts with the GPU. And if with our gaming handheld, if we were pulling 40 watts, well, we wouldn't have battery life for too terrible long. So it's going to be a delicate balance between optimal GPU settings and optimal battery life. More on that when we get to that video. I hope this video was useful and informative. I'm going to go ahead and close it out here, but I am going to go ahead and let the video run for the remainder of the loop that we take around all of these. You can see up close, things don't look too terrible bad. But when you start looking as you're driving or doing field work, well, the textures popping in pretty short distance from you really is going to get a bit distracting with these low auto settings. Let me know down in the comments below if you're trying to play Farm Sim on something with integrated graphics, or if you've got a really old GPU, then these settings may help you out. With respect to FSR, it is not like the NVIDIA DLSS where you need to have an AMD card in order for it to work. The FSR is basically open to AMD GPUs, NVIDIA GPUs, and Intel GPUs. If you do have an Intel GPU, well, Intel has its own upscaling technology that you can take a look at. Sadly, I don't have an Intel GPU available to me in order to try those out. But if you do have that, let me know your experience. Take a look at these road textures. The lines, they're just completely blurred out in the distance. Everything is splotchy. Like I said, it just looks like absolute trash on a 1080p screen running at these default resolution settings. Until next time, happy farming.